once again delighted to welcome Professor Sanderson, who's going to carry on with his readings, share his work with us, which I regard as incredibly important. And I think it's absolute delight that we're able to listen to Professor Sanderson share his work with us. So rather than me talking, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for coming in out of the nice weather into here. Nice to have someone in the audience at least. So last week we read verses 10 and 11 in which Abhinavagupta offered his obeisance to Utpaladeva as the pupil of Somananda and as the guru of Lakshmanagupta, his own guru, in the exegesis or the creation and exegesis of the Pratyabhijñā corpus. And by exposition of those verses, ended with consideration of the extent to which these authors were also to be recognized not merely as philosophers, but as engaged in forms of Shaiva practice. And so I showed that both Somananda and Utpaladeva are strongly connected with the Kaula tradition. In the case of Somananda, we know that that is the case inasmuch as he wrote a commentary on the work that is commonly referred to as the Para Trimshika, but is known to Abhinavagupta as the Trishika. So he wrote a commentary on that, Kaula commentary. It's a Kaula work. And we know from Utpaladeva, although we have no works that are directly in the exegesis of the Trika or the Krama or any of these non-dualistic systems, we have a body of poems, of devotional poetry attributed to him, which is redolent of the Krama. The Krama shines throughout that corpus of texts. It's very conspicuously present. And in that context, I made the point, reverting to my previous lecture on Bhuti Raja, that the mainstream of Shaiva non-dualism in Kashmir is dominated not by the Trika, but by the Krama. And that even though the Trika comes up very strong through the Tantrāloka, it's a form of Trika which has the Krama at its heart. And it's a rather, it's a tradition which makes big claims for itself, and one of those claims we saw in the lecture on Bhuti Raja was that essentially the Gita teaches the Krama, which is a rather surprising claim, but we saw that Maheshwaranandanatha, a South Indian guru of around the beginning of the 14th century, tells us that Abhinavagupta taught this in his commentary on the Krama Stotra, in his Krama Keli. That when Krishna assumed his Vishwarupa form, his cosmic form, at the beginning of the Mahabharata war, in order to encourage Arjuna to forget about his scruples and go ahead and do his duty, we saw that, according to Maheshwarananda, the Krama Keli sees this as Krishna entering into his inner nature as Kala Sankarshini, the goddess Kala Sankarshini, and through a glance initiating Arjuna in his true nature, which is a surprising example of pada prasarika, sticking your foot in the door, as it were. So we have strong Krama influence there. In the early Abhinavagupta, I argued that the early works of Abhinavagupta are pre-Trika works, dominated by the Krama. And I've pointed out also that Kshemaraja never, although he claims to be a devout disciple of Abhinavagupta, never puts the Trika in the center of the picture, but always the Krama. He said at least in two places in his works, surviving works, that the hierarchy of scripture, from the most general to the most specific, from the lowest to the highest, is from the Veda to the Krama, Vedadi Kramantam. And it seems that that was also the perspective of Utpaladeva, where at the core of his thinking is the Krama notion that enlightenment comes about by aesthetic awareness of the process of perception, whereby mind grasps an object and then introverts in the self-recognition of itself as the perceiver of that object. And I think one can argue, cogently enough, that the the Pratyabhijñā corpus, the Ishvara Pratyabhijñā Karika, teach this same method in a condensed and de-sectarianized language. But again, it's about recognizing the fundamental dynamics of cognition. Liberation through self-recognition by observing the dynamics of cognition, which is essentially what the Krama is about. So you could say that there's a kind of Copernican revolution in which the Krama is translated into a purely philosophical doctrine, enjoining a certain mode of insight or inculcating a certain way of seeing perception as a road to enlightenment, as a means of access to enlightenment. The essential notion here being that in every moment of perception, the enlightened state is revealed to us, but we don't grasp it. That the moment of I awareness, of ahamiti paramarsha, that arises in each moment of cognition, is a conduit through which one can enter into fully expanded awareness, which leaves behind the ego and contracted self. So I think that core idea is informing the Pratyabhijñā texts, and it comes from the Krama, the Kashmirian elaboration of the Krama, perhaps we should say, because the Krama scriptures themselves rather lack this degree of sophistication. Now, he has one more guru to introduce us to, and that is the most important of all in the context of this work, the Tantrāloka, and that is Shambhunatha. But he's next week. And in fact, if I had enough weeks, I could go on for quite a long time about Shambhunatha. He's a very interesting figure. But before we get on to Shambhunatha, we have to take a step sideways to acknowledge Abhinavagupta's father, who had a very important role to play in his education. So that's what we're going to look at today. But before I take that up, I want to take up the significance of a certain silence, which some may have noticed. I pointed out earlier that Abhinavagupta claims that the Tantrāloka draws upon all the Śaiva, the main Śaiva traditions, which he encapsulates in the doctrine of 3.5 lineages, or the 4 lineages, one being intimately associated with another and therefore only counting as a half. And we have seen in the previous verses that he acknowledged the Triambaka Santana, the non-dualistic exegesis of Utpala and others. He also acknowledges Bhutiraja and Maheshwara, covering another aspect of the Kaula tradition. And he also has acknowledged the Sri Santana, this mysterious tradition about which we know very little, except that it can be demonstrated it was another Kaula tradition connected with Machandanata, which surprisingly has gone, as it were, into obscurity, except that 2 of its initiation mantras survive in Kashmirian ritual. They are recited over the dead when they're being prepared to be taken to the cremation ground. So the interesting feature of Kashmirian priest worship, that very esoteric elements of the Śaiva tradition, which seem to have, as it were, disappeared, reappear in the death rituals. So, for example, the Pichumata, this rather extreme tantra, otherwise known as the Brahmayamala, has disappeared from view largely. Certainly Jayadatta couldn't get hold of a copy of it when he was writing his commentary on Tantrāloka, because he pretends to understand Abhinavagupta's references to it and clearly gets it wrong. And I think it's because he couldn't get access to a copy, and he assumed that no one else could either. So, okay, just say what you think it means. Of course, it's impossible to say, na janami. I don't know. He could have done that, but, you know, let's pause on that for a moment. Why is it impossible to say, I don't know, inside a prescriptive, dogmatic religious system? Well, because if there's any ignorance anywhere, the whole thing collapses. You're saying, my teacher didn't understand this, I don't understand it. You know, maybe you understand it. Once you admit that, you're putting the whole system in danger. No. So on the whole, the tradition has to maintain its omniscience at all costs, but this allows a considerable degree of innovation to occur, because of course it's a human institution and things are forgotten. Not everyone keeps up the same level of intimate understanding of every detail. The human brain is lazy, it gets by with what it needs and no more. So when it confronts an exegetical problem, it has to improvise. And so it's in these improvisations that these traditions develop, while pretending to be not improvising at all, just revealing eternally revealed fact. In fact, they're constantly creating new fact or new belief. Otherwise, the culture would be absolutely static. And of course, it's one of the myths about India, that it is static. You know, the Victorian myth of India, the unchanging village India, nothing ever happens, everything's always the same, no sense of history and the rest. In fact, there's a great deal of change going on, which becomes very obvious if you start looking at Shaivism. Huge religious changes occurring in the medieval period in India. But of course, it wasn't seen, for the most part, because everything was seen through the eye of the eternal Vedas. This empty box. I say empty because who knew what they meant for the last 2,000 years? Injunctions based upon them, well understood and implemented, but understanding, that's another matter. So we're going to look now at this question of why there's no reference to the Amardaka Santana, the dualistic tradition of the Siddhanta in these acknowledgements. He said that this work of mine, the Tantrāloka, exudes the essences of all these traditions, including the Siddhanta. So why hasn't he mentioned his guru who taught him in this particular tradition? Well, we know he did have a guru in that tradition because he mentions him at the end of the Tantrāloka in the final 37th chapter of the work. And you'll see that in items 2 and 3 on your handout. Amarda santati maharna vakarna dharaha sadaishikaira kavaratmaja vamanata. So I'm drawing your attention to 2 and 3. Amarda santati maharna vakarna dhara sadaishikaira varatmaja vamanata. So he's going through his teachings in this little passage. He's actually going through the teaching that his teachers in each of these 3.5 santanas or santatis. And he begins with that of the Amarda santati. Now you'll notice from the apparatus there that I have corrected that to Amarda. The manuscripts that I've consulted all read Ananda. I've only given the crucial manuscripts there, as does the edition in the Kashmir series of texts and studies. That, of course, is not in itself evidence, but it's a view, a hypothesis. And I've amended Ananda to Amarda. You may think that's cheeky, but, you know, when textual corruption occurs, it's usually the substitution of the banal for the unusual. A scribe losing his full attention for a moment, maybe he's itching behind the ear or something, you know. He, without thinking, sees what is familiar on the page rather than what is actually there. And you should know that nda and urda in the Sharada script are virtually indistinguishable. So that's a da, that's an nda, and that's a rda. They're indistinguishable actually, because Kashmiri is usually written, Sanskrit is usually written by Kashmirian scribes with a very thick pen, which I can't reproduce here. But you know, when it's done very small, it's really difficult to see the difference. So someone looking at that sees something nda, and so the confusion is simply of M and N. And if you doubt it, then you have to look at item 3, which reads Shri Santatis Triambakakya Tadarda Marda Sangita Itam Arda Chatasrotra Matika Shankare Krame. In the tradition taught by Shiva, Shankare Krame, there are in this way, itam, he's summarizing, 3.5, Arda Chatasro. Half 4 means 3.5. There are here in this tradition revealed by Shiva, Atra Shankare Krame, in this way, itam, 3.5 matika, 3.5 hospices. Actually, this is a technical term, it means traditions, like lodges, 3.5 lodges. The Sri Santati, that's that mysterious, not very well understood Kaula system. That called the Triambaka, the Trayambaka Santana, the non-dualistic. Tad Arda, which means that which has half of that, that's the Arda Triambaka lineage, transmitted through Triambaka's daughter according to the tradition. This is the Kaula Sampradaya. And then that called Amarda. And if you look at the apparatus there, you'll see again there's disagreement, but the reading Amarda is well supported. And my best manuscript, which is W, which is a manuscript of the Mula alone, the root text alone, uninfluenced by the transmission of the commentary, has the right reading before correction. That's what AC means, ante correctionem, before correction. So before some person went along and made it wrong by correcting it, the scribe had Amarda there, which is the correct reading. And you will see there that that reading is supported by not merely W before correction, but also by 3 other manuscripts that I've consulted, and indeed by the Kashmirian edition, the KSTS edition, which is worth recording because in true Pandit style, the editors have not recorded their manuscripts, and they don't systematically note the variants given in their manuscripts. So in a way, they are a witness, but we can't actually get at the primary evidence. And this is how not to do textual criticism. Please amend as much as you like, but record what's actually in the manuscript so you can see what your hypothesis is, and revise it if we don't like it. So I hope I've done that there. If you don't like this, you can decide there's an Ananda Santati if you wish. But there's one clinching argument, I think, to be added to this, and that is that the Siddhantika tradition records of itself in inscriptions that it descends from a mother monastery called the Amardaka Sthanam, or Amardaka Mata, in the city of Amardaka, Amardakapuram. And this is now conclusively demonstrated to be the town of Aunda, which is the site of one of the Jyotirlingas, located in Chhattisgarh, in the far east of Maharashtra. I'm not sure who has it under their administration at the moment. That area has been redefined somewhat, but it's near Sirpur, in what used to be Dakshina Kosala. So the identity of the place is quite clear, and all Shaiva lineages, when they begin their inscriptions, tend to refer to the Amardaka as a kind of the place where this tradition was first revealed, transmitted by the irascible sage Durvasas to human beings who've then passed it down to us. So I think there's no doubt that we're talking about the Amarda. So he's saying, look, I've got this guru in the Amarda Santana. His name is Vamanata, and he's the son, or possibly pupil, because son can be figurative, of a certain Erakanata. Interestingly, these are not, as stated, typical Siddhantika initiation names. It's possible that Vamanata is short for, or substitute for metrical reasons, for Vamadeva Shiva, or Vama Shiva, that's possible. But generally, Nata is used in the context of the Śākta-leaning Shaiva authors. Nonetheless, this guru, whatever his background, was an expert in the Siddhanta and trained Abhinavagupta in the Siddhanta. So we know he had a guru, but he's not acknowledged in these opening verses, which is telling us something. So why? So to illumine that question and give an answer to that question, or suggest an answer to that question, I've got a passage there on page 2. Is it numbered? It should be. 4. Yeah, it begins on page 2. And this is a passage from a work which Abhinavagupta wrote on the same Malini Vidyottara Tantra, the same exegetical focus as the Tantrāloka, called the Malini Shloka Vartika. And the Vartika here is a contentious analytic commentary on the verses of the Malini Vidyottara. Now, the text is not well transmitted, unfortunately, and it wasn't well studied either. No commentary survives, for example. But it's closely related to Tantrāloka because that helps us understand it. But very often there are parallel passages which illumine, in which each illumines the other sometimes. But I'm afraid there are many other passages which remain rather obscure. The number of manuscripts surviving is limited. They all go back to the same defective 19th century original. I mean, it's amazing that anything survived from Kashmir, actually, considering what the Kashmirian Brahmins had to put up with over the centuries. Mass book burnings under Sikandar, the idol smasher, and various other delightful figures in history. In spite of some very tolerant Muslim rulers, there were some very intolerant ones. And of course, intolerant rulers destroy, and destruction can't be undone. So there's quite a lot of damage inflicted on these transmissions as a result. But somehow, the Kashmiris kept their head above water and managed to transmit a great deal of this stuff. So here's this passage. It's been published in the Kashmir series of texts and studies, but also part of it, and part which includes these verses, has been published by a doctoral student of mine, now Professor Haneda of Marburg, as his doctoral thesis, which is an improvement on the Kashmiri edition, but still has a number of problems, especially in the translation, in my view. But nonetheless, that's a very impressive piece of work for a doctoral thesis. I think it was a step forward. So here is what we have. Tena Vaishnava Bauddhadi Shasanantranishthita Yata Samyang Namuchyante Natata Śaiva Samskrita Ati Marga Krama Kulla Trikasrota Untaradishu Parameshana Shasretu Ye Samyak Dikshita Nara Tesham Naiva Pavargasya Labe Bhedosti Kashchana. So, Tena, it is not the case that those initiated into the teachings of Shiva, Śaiva Samskrita, Shaivam, Śaive Samskrita. Śaiva means Shiva Proktam, that which has been taught by Shiva, or Śaivism if you like. I don't much like the ism word myself, but it's widely used. So it is not the case that those who have been initiated into the teachings of Shiva fail to be fully liberated. Namuchante na. It is not the case that they fail to be liberated. As is the case, as is the case with those who are committed to non-Śaiva teachings, such as those of Vishnu or the Buddha. So there he's making it quite clear. Shaivas are liberated, Vaishnavas and Buddhists are liberated from so much bondage, but not all bondage. This is the Śaiva view, the non-dualistic Śaiva view. All religious systems are efficacious, it's just a question of how efficacious they are. In the case of the Charvaka view, not very. In the case of the Vaishnava view, fine, pretty liberating, but not all the way. So it liberates from so much bondage, natu sarvasmat, but not from all bondage. Sorry, I shouldn't slip into Sanskrit, but there's a very nice passage in the Tantra Sara which says exactly this. That they liberate from so much, tavata eva munchati, natu sarvasmat. Only the Śaiva revelation reveals from the entirety of bondage, giving definitive and permanent liberation. That's their Śaiva view. Unsurprising, it is a religion, and religions generally question the claim of other religions to be fully efficacious. So it is not the case that those initiated into the teachings of Shiva fail to be fully liberated, as is the case with those who are committed to non-Śaiva teachings, such as Vaishnavas and Bauddhas. In other words, we're not saying that Siddhantikas don't get liberated. That's the first thing he's saying. Siddhantikas are also Shaivas, and all Shaivas are fully liberated at death, at least. And this is true if they have been initiated into the teaching of Shiva, be it the Atimarga, the Krama, the Kula, the Trika, or any other current of his diverse revelation. They all work. There is no difference at all as far as the attainment of liberation is concerned for those who have been properly initiated into the teachings of Parameshvara, the Supreme Lord, Shiva. Why don't you say properly initiated? Because you can be improperly initiated. And that's the fault of the guru. You turn up You make generous gifts, and the guru is seduced into thinking, oh yeah, this guy is generally motivated, Shiva wants him to be liberated. I'll go ahead and do the initiation ritual. But in fact, the guy is a con artist, he's not sincere, and will fall away immediately from his obligations, convert to Vaishnavism or Buddhism or whatever. So something has gone wrong. That person has not been truly initiated. You can't say that the initiation didn't work. Initiation is by very definition effective and efficacious. So all that can happen is that the guru misreads the signs, saying that Shiva wants you to do the initiation, when in fact he doesn't want you to do it. Okay? So that's why he says truly initiated, correctly initiated, properly initiated. Nor is there any route of access to full liberation apart from this. So it's quite dogmatic and clear. Only Shaivism works, the others don't work fully. And it works for all Shaivas, there's no difference here. So then he goes on to say, not only is this true, is there no difference at all as far as the attainment of liberation is concerned for those who have been properly initiated, there's also no route of access to full liberation other than Shaivism. I think he's made his point fairly unambiguous. It is just that, now he's going to explain the difference. It is just that in some systems, kevalam kvapi, in some systems such as ours, asmad darshaneshu, notice the plural, he recognizes that kind of field of meditation practice or systems, or worship systems, which are valid and bring about the highest result, the Trika, the Krama, and so forth. It's just that in some systems, such as ours, the highest success arises, parasiddhi, arises anayasa, without effort, effortlessly, anayasa. And through a liberation which is attained while one is still alive. So this is the crucial thing. Can the system, the Shaiva system, give you jivan mukti or just mukti, videha mukti, liberation once the body falls away? The standard Shaiva doctrine is that you have the initiation performed, nothing changes, you're just the same person, but you're laden with certain obligations the rest of your life as an initiate. But when you die, because the initiation has been performed, there's been a subliminal transformation which comes into view once death occurs. So you're not expected to go through any spiritual transformation in this life. It'd be quite nice if you do, and be appreciated, no doubt, if after initiation a person became more pious, more saintly, or whatever, more detached from worldly ambition and the like. But they recognize that this is not usually the case. Just as with people who convert to any religion, some seem more pious after the event, others are much the same rather unpleasant people they were before. We have to deal with that fact. While in other systems, and he means in other systems such as the Siddhanta, the ultimate reward is achieved slowly through a gradual sequence of meditations on one level after another in the ascending order of ontic strata, or levels of reality, from earth to Shiva. So he's referring here to liberation through yoga, occurring through graded meditations on the ascending hierarchy of tattvas. And this is, by the way, typical not only of the Siddhanta's yoga, but also of the Malini Vijayottara's yoga, which again teaches a graded hierarchy towards the goal. These Śākta non-dualists are philologically inaccurate when they claim that all these Śākta texts are teaching non-dualism. Only some contain non-dualistic teachings, and these are read into the whole corpus. In fact, a work like the Malini Vijayottara is not non-dualistic. It teaches a gradualist, hierarchical ascent to liberation, and it also teaches elaborate ritual. So our text ends here by saying, while in others, such as the Siddhanta, the ultimate reward is achieved slowly through a gradual sequence of meditations on one level after another, in the ascending order of ontic strata from earth to Shiva, and through many and various rituals. So the contrast is being made between a gradualist and ritualistic Shaivism, which is the Shaivism of the majority, which is identified with the Siddhanta, but is also to be found outside the Siddhanta in the Swachanda system, the Netra system, and so forth. That on the one hand, and a kind of spontaneist, instantaneous, Zen-like approach in which there is the doctrine of sudden enlightenment. And of course, to have a doctrine of sudden enlightenment, the idea that you could be in your body, as it were, but enlightened, without the limitations of physicality, you need to have a metaphysics which says there is no physicality. It's all consciousness. Consciousness manifests as though there were physicality, but in fact it's all just sentience. So you need to have a mind-only doctrine in order to accomplish. Otherwise, how on earth am I going to be liberated when my consciousness is trapped inside this skull? You know, it's not going to appear very convincing. So this seems to be the idea, that the Siddhanta is fully recognized by Abhinavagupta. He refers to its sources repeatedly in Tantrāloka, but he doesn't give it the honor of congratulating or offering obeisance to the person who taught him that system at the beginning of Tantrāloka. And because it's not a means to liberation in life. I think that's the crucial thing here. Of course, it's possible oops, I left him out. I did mention him in book 37. It's possible. But I think Abhinavagupta is a very conscious author. He's unlikely to have just slipped in that way. He's omitted him for a reason. Now, before going on to deal with Shambhunatha and his special relationship with Shambhunatha, we come to this question of his father. So before Abhinavagupta turns to Shambhunatha, he prays for the favour of his father Narasimhagupta. That rather implies that his father had passed on by then. And he refers to him using his vernacular name. He has two names. He has a Sanskritic name, Narasimhagupta, and he has a name by which he is known by the general population, Loke Prasiddha Namantaram, and another name current among the folk, the people, and that is Chukkalaka or Chukkala, which is a Kashmiri name. And I think I take this opportunity to point out that Kashmiri is not like Bengali or Hindi, something that developed in the medieval period, out of a supposed Middle Indic phase of the language, and gradually transformed into what we'd now recognize as Bengali, Gujarati, Rajasthani, or whatever. It's an ancient language. The ancestors of the Kashmiris have been speaking their own language for a very long time. And I think we have evidence of that in the Mahabharata. But even if that is questioned, which I think the evidence I found does stand up to scrutiny, but I'm not an expert on the history of Indo-Aryan languages. I would like other people to assess this. But we certainly know that in Abhinavagupta's time, Kashmiri is a fully developed separate language. It's not in some stage of transition, Middle Indic moving towards New Indo-Aryan. It's a really different language. And we have evidence not only from Abhinavagupta's references to words in Kashmiri, we have them from Kshemendra, the satirist, who works in vernacular expressions into his humorous satires. And we have it from India's first commentator of genius, Al-Biruni, the great scientist Al-Biruni, who had Kashmiri informants. He couldn't get into Kashmir because Kashmir had really pulled down the drawbridge at that period. They were rather worried about Muhammad of Ghazni getting in. In any case, it was a very isolated community, but he realized the importance of Kashmir as a center of learning and interviewed Kashmiris he found in Lahore and similar places which he could access. And he refers to Hindu festivals and beliefs in terms which are clearly Kashmiri. So clearly the language was not staggering along in a Middle Indic phase waiting to become Kashmiri. It was already fully separate language. So anyway, our Abhinavagupta's father has this vernacular name, Chukkala, which can mean he who has 4 granaries in Kashmiri, or 4 oilseed cakes. The latter would refer to his miserliness, because oilseed cakes, you press the seeds, you get some cake is left behind which you feed to your animals. Or in times of famine, human beings are known to resort to eating it. I don't think it's very nutritious, but it can keep you alive for a bit longer. So to call him 4 oilseed cakes would be a rather rude way of referring to him. So 4 granaries is perhaps a bit more flattering. It implies that he's quite a wealthy man, and that is appropriate because we know that his ancestor was endowed by King Lalitaditya with a substantial estate. Parikalpita Bhuri Sampat, in which the king settled on him substantial wealth, as well as a homestead on the shore of the bank of the Vitasta River with a splendid view of Mount Harmukh to the north. We know that from Tantrāloka. So he says here about his father, and this is item 5 at the bottom of your second page. Yah Purnananda Vishrantaha Sarva Shastra Artha Paraga Sashri Chukkalako Dishyad Ishtam Me Guru Uttama. Now I've amended the text there against all the manuscripts. And I do so, I think, for good reason. All the manuscripts read Yah Purnananda Vishranta Sarva Shastra Artha Paraga as one long compound. The only way to take that is essentially as 2 expressions. One is Purnananda Vishranta, and the other is Sarva Shastra Artha Paraga. And I cannot believe that any Sanskrit author would compound at that point. There's absolutely no need to do so. It's at the caesura between the 2 padas. It's not merely unnecessary, it's inelegant. So I've introduced a visarga there. So Vishranta, resting, immersed in all containing bliss. Purnananda Vishranta. Sarvashart Artha Paraga, who has gone to the further shore, Paraga, who has mastered the meaning, Artha, the teachings of every Shastra, Sarva Shastra Artha Paraga. That's not claiming he's an expert on Jainism. What is meant by Sarva Shastra Artha is grammar, mimamsa, nyaya, poetics, and so forth. The basic intellectual disciplines of medieval India. Intellectual and cultural disciplines of medieval India. So, immersed in all-embracing bliss and master of all learned disciplines, may Chukkalaka, the most venerable of my elders, may Guru Uttama, grant me, Dishyad me, my heart's desire, Ishtam, that which I desire. So he's praying to his father, who must be deceased, I think, to be prayed to, that he should further his accomplishment, which is the completion of this massive work, which he did accomplish, so obviously it worked. So the term that I've translated as elder here is guru. Now that could also be taken to mean spiritual preceptor, guru in the sense of spiritual preceptors. You know, in Sanskrit the word guru can mean anyone who's your elder, your older brother for that matter, your parents, anyone who's given you any ritual assistance they also can be seen as elders, requiring special respect. But the word guru also has another sense of spiritual preceptor, which is quite different. We mustn't confuse guru in that sense with guru in the other sense, elders. So the possibility that he means spiritual preceptor, which has, by the way, appeared in some translations of this verse, is excluded by the fact that in all his works, Abhinavagupta acknowledges his father only for taking on his early education in the basic Brahmanical sciences, or in some texts just in grammar, Vyakarana. There's no doubt that Chukalaka, or Narasimhagupta, was a Shaiva. He was a disciple of Bhutiraja, and therefore an initiate in the Krama. We know this. And this is, by the way, another argument for pushing us towards a conclusion that the commentary on the Gita is an early work by Abhinavagupta, because this same guru initiated his father, who now it seems has passed on. So it looks as if it's from an early phase of his career. Yeah. And we're going to look now at the evidence of in Abhinavagupta's works for the involvement of Chukalaka in his education. Now, the long passage which I put on page 3, we won't be able to read in its entirety, but the first part of verse 58, which is in bold, says, Pitra sa shabdagahane krita sampravesha. He's referring to himself in the third person, he, Abhinavagupta, I, in other words, Abhinavagupta, was made to be introduced, krita sampravesha, into the deep science of grammar, shabdagahane. He introduced me, he led me into the abyss of grammatical science, if you like. Gahana means a cave, and of course he means here that the discipline is a profound one, which takes a long time to master. And you may think, oh well, it just means he learned his ABC, learned the rudiments of Sanskrit grammar, never went beyond that. But in fact, he seems to have become a great grammarian. He wrote a commentary on the Pratyabhijñā of Bhartrhari. This is perhaps the most difficult of all linguistic treatises. And to undertake a commentary on it is really quite an achievement. And presumably he did it as quite a young man. We don't have it, I'm afraid. We just know that he did compose a commentary on the Pratyabhijñā of Bhartrhari. It's a major achievement, I imagine. So we have this passage there. But let's look at a bit of this biographical passage, because it's so unusual. We get a detailed account of anyone's biography in Indian sources. Most authors remain frustratingly unknown to us except through their pronouncements. So let's have a look at this. It makes a change of tone. Starting at the beginning, I've put 2 verses which are separated by some intermediate matter which doesn't matter. So 2 at the top, and then, so that's 38 and 39, and then we jump to 53 through to 59. Nishesha Shastra Sadhanam Kila Madhya Deshas. Kila, as we all know, Madhya Desha is the home of all learning. Nishesha Shastra Sadhanam Kila Madhya Deshas. The central part of North India, centering around Kanyakubja and similar places, in the Doab between the Ganges and the Yamuna rivers. Tasmin Jayata Gunabhyadiko Dvijanma Kopyatri Gupta iti namani rukta gotra. In that Madhya Desha, in that central kingdom, that central realm, was born a remarkable Kopi, Brahmin Dvijanma, of great virtue, Gunabhyadiko, superior of great virtue, Atrigupta, so he's referring to his ancestor Atrigupta, whose gotra is indicated by his name, Nama Nirukta Gotra, whose Brahmanical lineage, ancestral lineage going back to a rishi, is explained, Nirukta, by his name itself. He's Atrigupta of the Atri Gotra, in other words. Shastrabdi Charvana Kalodyad Agastya Gotra. Now this is a witticism, but in whom the Agastya Gotra arises, Udyad, through his skill, by virtue of his skill, in relishing Charvana, the ocean of Shastra, Shastrabdi. Now, what is he referring to there? Agastya, the sage Agastya, is famous for having swallowed all the water in the oceans in order to expose the Kaleya Titans and destroy them. So this is a well-known myth. Agastya drank the oceans dry, and his ancestor Atrigupta. He's praising him beyond measure for his learning, that he's like Agastya in that he drained dry the ocean of Shastra. He drank it all down, swallowed the lot. Tamata Lalita Aditya Raja Nijam Puram Anayat Pranaya Rabasat. As a result of his great affection, Pranaya Rabasat, King Lalita Aditya, the conquering king of Kashmir, Lalita Aditya, who's supposed to have defeated Kanyakubja, brought him to his own country. Puram here is referring to the country rather than the capital. Nijam Puramanayat Pranaya Rabasat Kashmirakyam, to his own country called Kashmir, Himalaya Murdagam, which rests on the summit of the Himalayas, high in the Himalayas, surrounded by mountains. Adivasdiyad Gauri Kanta Karayar Vijayadivi, which the beloved of Gauri, which Shiva Maheshwara, Adivasati occupies, in which he dwells, through his emanations. Karai means rays, through his emanations, beginning with Vijaya. Vijaya stands here for Vijayeshwara, or Vijaya Bhattaraka, who is the principal Shiva of the Kashmir Valley. At Vijayeshwara, Bij Bror in Kashmiri, Bij Bihara in a horrible Punjabiized version of the name. I'm afraid the toponyms of Kashmir have been horribly distorted by the rule of the Sikhs and the Dogras, who substitute various bastardized, semi-Punjabized forms of the names, which are still used in official documents, even though no Kashmiri uses them. So Bij Bihara instead of Bij Bror. Only the Mughal period documents reproduce fairly correctly the Kashmiri pronunciation of these names. So if you look at Abu Fazl, for example, you will see Bij Brar, which is pretty much correct. It's a stem form, nom to Bij Bror. Kashmiri has a very odd vowel system. It's a bit difficult to transcribe it consistently. But the Mughal period authors do so pretty effectively. Yes, so which Shiva occupies with his emanations beginning with Vijaya. Yugapad Akilam Bhoga Asaram Rasat Paricharvitam. This is an emendation from Paricharchitam, which yields no meaning. Out of eagerness, Rasat, to relish fully, Paricharvitum, the flood of enjoyments which Kashmir has to offer, in other words, simultaneously. Yugapad Akilam. He wished, as though, this is a fan's poetic conceit, he occupies the valley of Kashmir with countless emanations, beginning with Vijaya, as though he were eager simultaneously to enjoy the flood of pleasures that is offered by this wonderful, happy valley of Kashmir. Let me just pause for a moment to say that there are two Kashmirs. There's this fantasy Kashmir, which is indeed very beautiful, and there's a real Kashmir, which was subject to appalling famines, repeated floods, in which hundreds of villages were annihilated, in which the population goes down by 60% sometimes as a result of famine. I mean, really not such a happy valley after all. But nonetheless, people living in it could see the beauty of the place. And so Abhinavagupta dwells on this, the beauty of its natural surroundings, its abundant wine and various other pleasures, the fact that the place is alight at night with the glowing kundalinis of enlightened women and so forth. He clearly loves his native land, but it was in reality a tough place to live, with life expectancy very low. In 1891, it was 20 for men, 19 for women. Not good. If you got through your childhood, you had a good chance of reaching at least late middle age, I suppose, but I wonder how many 90-year-olds there were around. Anyway, I just point that out. He wishes to concentrate on the beauties of the place. Tasmin kubera purachari sitangshu mauli samukya darshana viruda pavitra bhave vaitastaroda sinivasam amushya chakre rajad vijasya parikalpita buri sampat. There, Tasmin, the king, Raja, made a dwelling, a home for that Brahmin. Nivasam Amushya Dvijasya Chakre, on the bank of the Vitasta. Vitasta is a second derivative from Vitasta. Vitasta is the main river that drains the Kashmir Valley, arising in the southeast at Verinag, meandering through the valley and flowing out through the gorge of Baramulla at the other, in the northwest. So he made for him a home, gave him a jagir, on the banks of the Vitasta river, Parikalpita Buri Sampat, which was provided with abundant wealth. In other words, he's giving him plenty of land to cultivate, and presumably the serfs who are also cultivating that land, he gets the revenue from that land, and therefore has a perpetual living. Tasyanvaye Mahiti Kopi Varaha Gupta Nama Babuva. Now, in his lineage, Tasya Anvaye, in this great lineage of his, Tasya Anvaye Mahati, there was Babuva, a certain person, Kopi, whose name was Varahagupta. So in this lineage, at some point, we're not told how many generations, a few, a certain Varahagupta was born. Bhagavan Swayamantakale Girvana Sindhu Lahari Kalitagra Murda Yasyakarot Paramanugraham Agrahena. A certain remarkable kopi, by the way, a kopi is commonly used in Sanskrit in the meaning extraordinary, as in American slang. She's some girl, meaning exceptional or remarkable, not run-of-the-mill. So kopi likewise in Sanskrit can mean extraordinary. Lokotra, apurva, adrishtapurva, and so forth. So a certain remarkable Brahmin called Varahagupta was born. Yasya anugraham akarot Bhagavan Swayam, whom the Lord, whose head is adorned with the Ganges, the top of whose head is adorned with the Ganges, poetic periphrasis for Shiva, whom Shiva initiated, bestowed the highest favour upon, at the time of his death, Antakale. So this indicates in the Shaiva context that Varahagupta was not a Shaiva, but on his deathbed called for Shaiva initiation, with his deathbed initiation in Shaivism. The difference is that if you intend to go on living after initiation, then when the Guru removes all the bonds of the soul, he leaves the current karma in place, otherwise you drop dead. But if you're on your deathbed, and the text says, make sure he really is dying before you do this, then you remove prarabdha karma. Prarabdha karma is also removed, prarabdham karma. Prarabdham karmapi shodhaniyam. That karma too must be removed. So if the guy lives on, that shows the initiation hasn't worked. So make sure you only do it if the person is really at death's door. So it looks as though Varahagupta, at the end of his life, called for Shaiva initiation. This is a rather interesting remark. Now he had a son, Chukulaka, this Narasimhagupta, as he goes on to say. But I haven't translated the nicest bit, at the beginning of 52. Tasmin kubera purachari sitang shumali samukya darshna viruda pavitra bhave vaitasta srotsi. He made a home for him on the bank of the Vitasta, whose purity, whose sanctity, pavitra bhava, whose pavitrata, was increased, intensified, viruda, by the view of facing toward, that came about by facing Samukya, Shiva, dwelling in the north. So if you look up north, if you're in the valley of Kashmir on the bank of the Vitasta, looking north, you see the highest mountain of the valley, enclosing the north, which is Mount Harmukh, anciently Haramukuta, the crown of Shiva. So that's what he's referring to. It's this wonderful place on the riverside, looking out towards the mountain, the sacred mountain Harmukh. So not only is it pure by virtue of it being on this sacred river, this Vitasta, which is thought to remove all sins of those who bathe in it and so forth, he also has the additional sanctity of having this fantastic view from his bedroom window, as it were, of looking out and seeing this Mount Harmukh. So, Tasyatmajash Chukkalaketi Jane Prasiddhas Chandravadata Dishano Narasimhagupta. His son was Narasimhagupta, popularly known Jane Prasiddha by the name Chukkalaka, whose intellect Dishana, this is a Bahuvrihi, whose intellect was as spotless, as pure, as white, as clean as the moon. Chandra, yeah, the moon has a spot on it, but never mind. We have to imagine a spotless moon here, whose intellect was absolutely lucid and clear and uncontaminated by not stupidity, but rather moral defects. The idea is he is a person whose awareness is absolutely spotless. Yam sarva shastra rasa majana shubhra chitta maheshwari paramalankurati sma bhakti, whom devotion to Shiva, maheshwari bhakti, supremely adorned. So he was supremely adorned by devotion to Shiva. He whose mind, chittam, was shubhra, free of taint, pure, as a result of bathing, some immersion, majjana, in the waters of all the shastras. Sarva shastra, rasa, majjana, shubhra chittam, maheshwari, paramalankurite sma bhakti. So not only is he a learned scholar of the basic trivium of Brahmanical knowledge, he's also a devotee of Shiva. That's the crucial difference. Tarunya sagra taranga bara napohya, avoiding, literally pushing to one side, apohya, the burdens, baran, posed by the waves of the ocean of youth. He means romance, pursuit of wealth, and all the other distractions of adult life. A taruna doesn't mean a youth exactly. A yuvan, or a taruna in Sanskrit, is a person pre-middle-aged. Post-16, pre-middle-aged. So it's a rather broader category. So of normal adult life. He avoided the drawbacks of normal adult life, marriage, property, sycophancy to kings and all the rest. He got rid of all that, and hatena, immediately, without delay, forcibly, firmly mounted the boat, the porta, of detachment. So he gave up worldly things very early and devoted himself to the spiritual life. I'm not sure what his wife had to say about that. we don't hear much about her except that she died young. So having mounted the boat, portam, of detachment, vairagya, bhakti rohanamavapya, having reached the Rohana mountain of devotion. This has been misunderstood. Rohana is the name of a mythical mountain which consists entirely of jewels. So it's the avaricious person's, dream of somehow finding the way to Mount Rohana. So having reached, as a result of getting onto this boat of detachment, he reaches the Rohana of devotion, of one-pointed devotion to Shiva, and there smashed dalayati sma, with the jewels of meditation upon Shiva. He gets the jewels from the mountain, and with these rocks, he smashes bhavapadasta, those well-known drawbacks of mundane existence. Literally, those well-known disasters, apads, which constitute mundane existence. Marriage, offspring, the ingratitude of offspring, etc., etc. There's plenty of Sanskrit literature on the pointlessness of mundane life, and at the end you just feel totally disillusioned. You've brought up these children, they're now your enemies. This is more perhaps a royal perspective than an ordinary perspective, but nonetheless, there's plenty of literature. Nilakanta Dikshita is very eloquent on his sense of vairagya at the end of his life, how he's worked hard all his life to become a great scholar and a minister and a wealthy man, and now his family are plundering everything. They don't care, they're just thinking about the inheritance, etc., etc. Yeah. So these are the bhavapadasta, those well-known ta, bhavapada, disasters that constitute mundane existence, bhava. Tasyatma Abhinavagupta iti prasiddha Sri Chandra Chuda Charanabja Paragaputa. His son, Tasya Atmaja, he who is well known as Abhinavagupta. He's referring to himself in the second person, a bit like Trump, but rather different case, for different motivations, I think. So his son was this person well known under the name Abhinavagupta, Sri Chandra Chuda Charanabja Paraga Puta, who has been purified, Puta, by the pollen, Paraga, from the lotuses that are the feet of Lord Shiva, he who has the crest of the moon upon his head. Mata vyayuyujadamum kila balya eva. Kila. He has been told, it has been said, he doesn't know this from personal experience, it has been said, Kila, that his mother separated him from her when he was just a baby, balya eva, when he was just an infant. In other words, the Kila indicates that this happened before the age of the onset of childhood amnesia. So he learned from his family that he'd lost his mother, if not in childbirth, because he had a younger brother who came along later, of course, but early on in his life, when he was still perhaps a toddler, his mother died. So my mother separated him from her when he was just a child, I am told, Kila. Daivam hi bhavi parikarmani samskaroti. For fate plays a part, samskaroti, in the preparation of the future. Bhavi parikarmani samskaroti. So he's looking at it positively. Okay, I lost my mother as a child, but that stimulated me in a certain spiritual direction for the rest of my life. Mata param bandhur iti pravada. The saying goes, iti pravada, that mother above all is kin. She's the ultimate kin, to whom you are deeply bound by attachment and so forth. Sneho tigadu kurite hipashan. For love, maternal love, the love of one's mother, sneho, makes the bonds of the soul, pashan, the bonds, extremely hard to break. Atigadi kurute hipashan. So that love between mother and son holds you in the world and prevents you from detaching yourself from the world completely. Tanmula bande galite kilasya manye stita jivata eva mukti. In my view, manye, when the bondage, bande, rooted in her, tanmula bande, has dissolved, galite, then for him, Abhinavagupta, in my view, manye, liberation was established of him in life itself, of him actually living. So he's saying, by the loss of my mother, tragic though it was, I was freed of this root connection, this radical connection of affection, and that enabled me to move on to liberation in life itself, because I didn't have the mother holding me back. So it's a somewhat negative view of maternal love. Anyway, that's what he's saying. Then, Pitrasa Shabda Gahane Krita Sampravesha. He was then introduced to the study of grammar, Panini and its exegesis, including Bhartrahari, it seems, by his father. Tarkarnavormi Prishata Malaputa Chitta. And his mind was purified of all taint, mala, by the spray from the waves of the ocean of philosophical reasoning. So he was introduced first to grammar and then tarka, namely nyaya and science of reasoning and so forth. This is the basic trivium of Kashmirian medieval education. Grammar, tarka and sahitya, belles lettres, artistic writing. Sahitya Sandarasa Bhoga Paro Mahesha Bhaktya Swayam Grahana Durmadaya Grahita. And while he was intent upon relishing the flavor, the moist flavors of literature, the delicious flavors of literary writing, he moved on from grammar and logic to aesthetic writing. And while he was immersed in the appreciation of literature, he was suddenly seized, grihita, by devotion to Shiva, Mahesha Bhaktya. A devotion which was Swayam Grahana Durmadaya, which was characterized by a madness that insisted upon seizing him of its own accord. He had no say in the matter. Just suddenly he was swamped by devotion to Shiva. He didn't think that would be quite nice to get to know Shiva. It's just suddenly this emotion overpowered him. And then sa tanmayi bhuya naloka vartanim ajiganat kamapi kevalam puna tadiya samboga vivridaye pura karoti dasyam guruvesh masu swayam. Having become one with that, having immersed himself in that flood of devotion to Shiva, tanmayi bhuya, having become one with that, he gave no value to the way of the world thereafter. Na loka vartanim ajiganat, aorist, duplicated aorist, ganayami, I count or I value. He no longer valued the ways of the world. Time to get married, find a bride, have children, etc., etc. Only, kevalamapi tadiya samboga vivridi, in order to intensify his experience of that, bhakti, he became pura karoti dasyam. He made slavery. He made himself a slave, freely, swayam, of his own free accord, in the homes of teachers, Guru Veshmasu. And after that he goes on to mention the Amarada Santana and the other Santanas. So I'm sorry, that took rather a long time, but I thought it might be interesting to read that, because it's not, you don't get too much of that in Sanskrit literature. You actually get to feel Abhinavagupta is present somehow through reading that. You get some sense that there's a person there. He's not just a kind of shastric robot following along certain preordained lines. He has a human being living a life and expressing himself. Yes. Then the only thing that I was going to discuss after that, and I don't have the time to do so, was how far this education went. And I'm of the opinion that although he mentions only grammar here, in other works he acknowledges his father for having given him a body and the sciences, plural. Deha vidyabhi. And I think therefore what he means is the basic disciplines of Brahmanical learning. He didn't teach him Shaivism, although they had the same guru, but it was he that trained him in these basic disciplines, and these basic disciplines severed his interest in mundane life. He became convinced that he was going to be a scholar for the rest of his life, and had no illusions that that was consistent with being a married man. And he says elsewhere in his works that once he'd shown this complete commitment to learning, no one mentioned these things again. No one said, you're going to, his mother had died, so she wasn't there to nag him about having children. Getting married. Are you never going to marry? Are you never going to have, am I going to die without grandchildren? So he never had that pressure thereafter. Was able to pursue his life of learning and spirituality unhindered and presumably supported by a regular income from this ancestral holding on the bank of the Vitasta. Although when it came to writing the Tantrāloka, apparently that wasn't quiet enough. So one of his patrons, obviously with royal connections or ministerial connections, arranged for him to move to a house where there were in an area where there were only Shaivas. He said, don't make any noise. The great Abhinavagupta is working on the Tantrāloka. So he was able to work in peace in this house put at his disposal. In, I suspect, Vijayeshwara, the town of Vijayeshwara, which was the Śaiva town. And I think maybe advertisements for rentals probably said, Vaishnavism Buddhists need not apply. Yeah, I don't know for sure, of course. Anyway, let's stop there.